The disastrous raid by the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment near Karbala was one of the most alarming defeats of US forces in the Iraq War. Were it not for the rugged construction of their Apache helicopters and the skill of the pilots and gunners, more aircraft and airmen could easily have been lost. The raid itself sparked considerable debate about the use of attack helicopters and the suitability of the US Army's attack helicopter doctrine and tactics. US 5th Corps had tasked the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment to attack the Iraqi Republican Guard's 2nd Medina Armoured Division ahead of the US 3rd Infantry Division's assault through the narrow Karbala Gap, the main Iraqi defensive line before Baghdad. This was to be a classic shaping operation. The US Army defines a shaping operation as an action to create and preserve conditions for the success of a decisive operation. In this case, the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment would destroy as much of the Medina Division's key armour and artillery capabilities as possible to cripple the force prior to the offensive. The nature of this task called for what is known as an attack helicopter deep strike. Deep strike was first fully conceptualized in 1982, with the introduction of the US Army's radical air-land battle doctrine. Previously, attack helicopters in a high-end conventional war were to act as a mobile anti-tank reserve, using their speed to get ahead of and ambush any Soviet armoured breakthrough with rocket and TOW missile fire. By rotating helicopters in and out of the engagement, they could maintain the pressure until conventional forces could arrive to plug the gap in the line or counterattack. However, air-land battle altered how the Army conceptualized these fast-moving mechanized engagements. The new doctrine placed greater emphasis on the extended battlefield and hitting supporting assets, such as artillery, command and control, and uncommitted follow-on forces, to influence the battle raging at the front line. Attack helicopter proponents argued that with the fast-moving nature of the battlefield, gaps in the enemy's front line would naturally appear, through which battalions of the new AH-64 Apache could infiltrate, then locate and attack key targets en masse, which would isolate and paralyze the enemy forces at the front. This new deep strike tactic was first employed by Army attack helicopter battalions in Operation Desert Storm, to degrade Iraqi forces prior to the ground offensive. In the eyes of the US Army, its attack helicopter deep strike doctrine had been vindicated by the 1991 Gulf War. The Apache's next chance for combat came in 1999, as part of Operation Allied Force against Serbia. Operation Allied Force sought to end the atrocities the Serbian security forces were committing in Kosovo by forcing Serbian President Milosevic to withdraw his army. Just 4 days before the start of the air campaign, NATO Commander General Wesley Clark had the idea to deploy a force of 24 AH-64A Apaches, supported by M270 multiple launch rocket systems to neighbouring Albania. The basic concept of operation was that the Apaches would conduct deep strikes to destroy Serbian army units in Kosovo, covered by the MLRS, which would use their long-range rocket fire to suppress Serbian air defences. Task Force Hawk, as it became known, suffered several setbacks, including the loss of 2 airmen when their Apache crashed on a training flight in Albania. Difficulties integrating Apaches into the day-to-day planning of the air campaign, concerns about collateral damage caused by the MLRS, and the success of the switch to political and economic targets by the NATO air forces all conspired to keep the Apaches from participating. One particular concern for Task Force Hawk and NATO planners was how the Serbian army was deployed. To avoid destruction from the air, Serbian troops and tanks were dispersed piecemeal in villages across Kosovo. Deep strike was designed for destroying troop concentrations and would be ineffective against large numbers of small scattered targets. Furthermore, planning staff were concerned such attacks in built-up areas would cause substantial civilian casualties. The war ended on the 10th of June without Task Force Hawk seeing combat. In 2003, in preparation for Operation Iraqi Freedom, 151 AH-64A and D Apaches had been deployed in theatre. In January that year, Apache crews from the 101st and the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment had honed their skills on exercises in Germany and Poland, rehearsing deep strikes against Iraqi armoured formations before deploying to the Gulf. While Marines trained for amphibious assaults and airborne forces for parachute landings, deep strike had become the US Army attack aviation's unique specialised form of decisive action. The 11th AHR had been slated to conduct a deep strike on the first night of the war, again to shape the battlefield ahead of 3rd Infantry Division's breach on the Iraq-Kuwait border, but this was called off due to poor flying conditions. 3 days later, the regiment received its warning order for the strike against the Medina division, but with mounting problems with supply, meaning only half of the allotted 60 Apaches could participate, anxiety grew amongst the pilots and ground crews that the war would be over before they got into the fight. The fuel shortage was only the first of a slew of causes that led to the outcome of the raid against the Medina division. Scant intelligence on Iraqi dispositions meant that the crews of the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment had little idea of what they would be flying into, much less attacking. The formidable J-STARS system was theoretically meant to cue such deep strikes, using its ground mapping radar to track enemy forces. But J-STARS could only detect moving vehicles, so was ineffective against the largely static Iraqis around Najaf and Karbala. To make matters worse, the US Army and Air Force drones were all tasked on other operations, leaving none to shore up the intelligence picture. The regiment's staff only had the vaguest idea of where the 2nd Brigade of the Medina Division was, leading to the 11th AHR's commanding officer, Colonel William Wolfe, to adapt the mission so that the regiment would be searching for the 2nd Brigade's artillery and armour before attacking it. Worse still, Iraqi communications intercepted by Army intelligence suggested that the Iraqi army was expecting an attack helicopter strike. With Task Force Hawk in 1999, one of the main concerns was the dispersed nature of Serbian forces, presenting a poor and imprecise target for the Apache battalions. Yet, the little detailed intelligence 5th Corps had suggested that the Iraqis were arranged in a similarly dispersed manner, rather than the massed conventional forces that were the intended target of deep strikes. The next problem was the poorly coordinated supporting fires. 5th Corps rocket artillery and the Air Force were both to suppress Iraqi air defences with Atacms missiles and airstrikes. However, the 11th AHR's raid was delayed by over 2 hours, which was not properly communicated to the US Air Force. Meanwhile, the artillery's Atacms were launched at suspected air defence sites 30 minutes before the Apaches were due to arrive on station. This was done to avoid friendly fire, as having tactical ballistic missiles dispensing cluster munitions over the target area would be hazardous if the Apaches were present, but the 30-minute buffer only served to warn the Iraqis of the strike and gave them time to prepare. Finally, the Iraqis' air defence strategy was totally unexpected. Wisely, the Iraqis decided to forego air defence radars, which US forces could easily detect and destroy, instead opting to create walls of small arms and light anti-aircraft fire that American helicopters would have to fly through. US intelligence had not predicted this, so when the Apache crews were ambushed by the hail of Iraqi fire, there was little they could do other than attempt to fight through it. The massive sandstorm which swept across Iraq from the 25th to the 26th of March put a stop to almost all operations and allowed for US forces to reflect on the unsuccessful raid. The nature of the defeat drew strong reactions from many. 5th Corps Commanding Officer Lieutenant General William S. Wallace proclaimed that deep operations with the Apache, unless there's a very clear need to do it, are probably not a good idea. General David Petraeus' 101st Airborne Division did not have the luxury of opting out of deep strikes. Its Apache battalions constituted the bulk of the division's mobile firepower, and if the Screaming Eagles could not use their attack helicopters to clear the way for their light infantry, then the division would not be able to fight as it was designed to. The day after the raid, the command staff of the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment teleconferenced with their colleagues in the 101st Airborne's Aviation Brigade, discussing their experience and the lessons they had drawn from the vicious engagement. The 101st Airborne absorbed those lessons as quickly as possible. 5th Corps tasked the 101st Apaches to strike the Medina Division around Karbala again, to shape the battlefield for both the 3rd Infantry Division and the 101st's own upcoming operations. Operation Destiny Reach began at 20:35 hours on the 28th of March. 36 Apaches of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 101st Aviation Regiment, lifted off from their forward operating base north of Najaf. The evening did not start perfectly as one aircraft crashed in brownout conditions on takeoff. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of the 11th AHR, the 101st plan played to the speed and mobility offered by attack helicopters. In a left-hook right-hook style attack, 1st Battalion headed north over the Razaza Lake to surprise the enemy by attacking from the Medina Division's rear. The 2nd would then attack from the south to keep the Iraqi forces in Karbala off balance and guessing. Tactically, the 101st implemented more lessons. Rather than the wingman system used on the first night, each company of 6 Apaches adopted a new formation. 3 Apaches formed the centre of the formation, providing the bulk of the forward firepower. Meanwhile, another Apache guarded either flank, manoeuvring more freely to watch for threats to the formation. The 6th was to cover the rest of the company from behind, ready to suppress any attack from underneath the lead helicopters. This meant that the formation had far better situational awareness and could more effectively respond to sudden threats and ambushes. This time, the MLRS fire arrives just 4 minutes ahead of the lead Apaches. The fire targeted known and suspected air defence sites, and the barrage continued for longer, keeping the Iraqi fighters' heads down as the 1st Battalion began their attack. This time they only found some light vehicles and dismounted troops, which they rapidly dispatched. None of the Medina Division's tanks and artillery presented themselves. In the south, the 18 AH-64s of 2nd Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment, had better luck. Their 3 companies adopted the same new protective formation. As the American helicopters approached, the city lights blacked out for a few seconds, a signal to the Iraqi fighters and AA gunners to open up just like they had on the first night. The Americans now had a counter to this tactic. The Apaches withdrew as the Iraqis opened fire, and steadily destroyed the anti-aircraft systems and troop concentrations with Hellfire missiles from a safe distance. However, the Apaches were supported by orbiting strike aircraft, in this case, US Navy FA-18 Hornets and RAF Tornadoes, who were directed onto targets by the helicopters. The pairing of fixed and rotary wing assets was highly effective, and allowed the Apaches to maraud over the battlefield and hunt down the Medina Division's armour, while the AA was neutralised by laser-guided bombs. By 2200 hours, Operation Destiny Reach was over. Despite the Iraqis' best efforts, only 1 Apache was slightly damaged by enemy fire. A further AH-64 was damaged on landing due to brownout conditions. In total, the 101st claimed 12 tanks and APCs, 11 anti-aircraft guns, 3 artillery pieces, a mix of 20 technicals and trucks, and at least 35 enemy personnel. The total, while not stunning, did demonstrate that attack helicopter battalions could successfully conduct deep strikes in conjunction with supporting arms. However, in their own assessment of the deep attack, the 101st's divisional staff highlighted the problem foreshadowed by Task Force Hawk, that the enemy did not present a massed target array. Consequently, risks of conducting deep attacks, especially night desert landings, outweigh potential effects on target. Operation Destiny Reach was the last major deep strike operation conducted by attack helicopter battalions during the Iraq War. Apaches still provided invaluable service in close air support of ground forces, as well as armed reconnaissance and flank security roles, but no substantial concentrated Iraqi forces presented themselves for the rest of the conflict. Thanks again to our amazing patrons who make series like this possible. Welcome to all our new patrons this month, and a special thanks to our patron of the week, Gauta. Each week we choose our favourite Patreon comments to shout out. This week, Scott says, a classic situation of they learn, we learn. If you'd like to support us to produce further series like this, please join our Patreon and get access to exclusive benefits such as early access to videos and sponsor free. We would love to have you as part of our community and really appreciate your support.